Hello, friends of philosophy, and welcome to my little series where I want to read Hegel with you together, and in particular, a very difficult book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, there are already some projects where people read Hegel on YouTube, but I really want to go with you line by line. Now, Hegel is a philosopher who's very hard to understand, and many people say that he uses such a difficult style to show off, to make himself bigger than he is. And in fact, it is true that Hegel's philosophy is very difficult to read. But is it really because he's a horrible writer? Well, let's first listen to what some people say in that regard, especially here, the School of Life, famous philosophy channel, who made a very neat video about Hegel, but let's listen to it a little bit.
Hegel wrote some very long and very famous books, among them The Phenomenology of Spirit, The Science of Logic, and Elements of the Philosophy of Right.
So yeah, this is true. These are the important books, and nobody that who I know of my friends who didn't study philosophy has really engaged in these books because they are so difficult. They have read other philosophical books, but they didn't read these. Nevertheless, these are famous books because they influenced so many traditions. The Phenomenology of Spirit presents a new way of thinking, I would like to say, a dialectical way of thinking, which is the groundwork for many of our postmodern thoughts, for, let's say, existentialism, deconstructionism, but also for a lot of theories that we have in art. The way he thought logic was an entirely new way, and also the philosophy of right had elements that were saying, well, the way we do law should be different. It should not be based on intuitive principles. It should be dialectical, and we have to figure out what that means. But let's listen to the School of Life a little bit more.
But, we'll be frank, he wrote horribly. His work is confusing and complicated when it should be clear and direct.
So this is like an idea, right? So like philosophy should be clear and direct. So one student once asked me, like, why don't you just give us the definitions? And she was really angry. That was when I was very young and I was teaching tutorials for a professor. And she didn't understand that the final exam, we didn't want to see definitions that she learns from a book. We wanted to see how she discusses problems and ideas. Now, see, in philosophy, we have different strategies. And I think one of the strategies that was popular before Hegel, and is also still popular after Hegel, was so-called intuitionism. And that means you start with a small insight where you claim, well, everybody sees that that is true. And then you build a system on the base of that. It's based on an intuition. You say, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Everybody knows that. My students always show me something like, hey, here, look, it's 4, right? And then they say, well, that should be enough to have a consistent, coherent theory. But as we all know, or I think as we should all know, it's not that easy. And Hegel develops, out of the tradition, of course, a new style of philosophy that deals with this fact that we don't get down to the intuition. And I think for that reason, his language is incredibly difficult. And it is also a reason why we don't find really interesting quotes from Hegel. So I looked up 28 most famous Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel quotes. So already this title of this listicle is kind of funny, right? Because we say the most famous quotes. Well, here, very famous. Nothing great in the world was accomplished without passion. What does that even say? That's meaningless. It's meaningless as a standalone quote. It doesn't tell us very much. Let's see whether we have some more here. That is indeed famous, but maybe more among philosophers. All that is real is reasonable, and all that is reasonable is real. And many people think that Hegel believes that reality is rational because they take it as a standalone quote and again, and don't see it in the dialectical development where he says, well, see, the process is one of the key elements of how we understand things. We cannot break it down to a single statement. And single statements are statements, for example, also like the universe is infinite. Then somebody else comes, no, the universe is finite. And then they struggle with each other. Or somebody says, God exists. And then somebody comes and says, no, God does not exist. Same problem. We deal here with intuitive sentences, and I say Hegel is not so much interested in that. Let's listen a little bit more into this video.
He tapped into a weakness of human nature, to be trustful of grave-sounding, incomprehensible prose. This has made philosophy much weaker in the world than it should be, and it's made it much harder for us to hear the valuable things that Hegel has to say to us.
So this is the claim of the School of Life, and I find that very interesting because I think it's not necessarily true. Hegel had a style that was acknowledged around that time. Many people wrote in a very similar way to how he wrote. By the way, I have to sneeze. So, okay, now I'm better. So many people wrote like he wrote, so it was acknowledged back then. But then with the rise of, let's say, analytic philosophy, we say something that we want to have simpler texts because it is said that if somebody cannot understand your system, well, how can you criticize it? So you should make yourself as understandable as possible. And this is certainly true in some regards, but what I figured out very often is that, especially when I read American analytic philosophy, I read many, many, many pages and there are not so many information in there. And I feel when I read philosophy of Hegel with other people together, there is so much to discuss in one single sentence. And the density of information is worth it. I claim this guy does not waste much time. He goes right to the point very often. And so you can start in the middle of his philosophy and you discuss one sentence for many hours and you gain more insights than reading maybe 30 pages of plain analytic philosophy. Now, because of this, Hegel was, of course, rejected for a very long time from the tradition. So analytic philosophers, they often looked like this after they read Hegel and they said, especially Russell, he said, no, this is bullshit. Russell came out of this tradition where Hegel was just adopted in Great Britain. He was already rejected in German. That is because Hegel was much later translated into the English language. And then he became famous around, I guess, 1876. I believe that was one of the first translations by Wallace. And Russell was in that tradition, but he felt, and it may have been true, that many people just talked for the prestige, same as the School of Life was criticizing it, and they were just utilizing his philosophy to show off. And then he developed a more analytic style that then became the accepted paradigm. There are more stories to be told. I'm one of the people who believes that the rise of analytic philosophy is closely related to the rejection of Hegel. I don't want to dive into that too much, but nowadays Hegel became again very important. I studied in Pittsburgh. I don't claim to be an expert on Hegel, but I wrote my dissertation about Hegel. Still, I want to discuss it because I think there is no final answer on what Hegel really says. But Pittsburgh nowadays is probably one of the centers of philosophy, and it's called the Center of Neo-Hegelianism, right? So Hegel is definitely worth studying if we want to understand what is going on nowadays. And I promise you, if you go through this phase, this phase, then you will recover. You will get back to this year. And you will be a better suited individual who can deal with theoretical problems that we usually engage. And you will not be committing any more these plain mistakes as there are, for example, claiming that God exists or claiming that God does not exist, but thinking about it in a more dialectical way. So, and this is what I plan to do with you. I don't want to prepare Hegel only through memes. Memes are fun and games, right? But actually, we want to read the phenomenology of spirit. And therefore, let's dive right into that. Now, it's called the phenomenology of mind here. That's translation of the German word Geist, of course. We can translate that in a different way. I would say spirit is definitely a better translation. But please don't understand it as the real existence of ghosts. Okay, we shouldn't call it the phenomenology of ghost, which would also be a possible translation. It deals with metaphysics, but it says phenomenology here before. And hey, here's the weird thing. So I'm one of the people, I learned that from Tom Rockmore, famous philosopher too. He said, well, probably the phenomenology of spirit is a phenomenology. And hey, dude, man, yeah, it says phenomenology. But this is not the common opinion. People think that we cannot read it as a phenomenology, that it's still related to the older tradition. I read it as a phenomenology, as the title implies. I follow here Tom Rockmore, and what does that mean? Now, phenomenology means that, first of all, we bracket off all assumptions that we have about the world. So, for example, that there is a reality behind the phenomena that we experience. There may be a reality, okay, I'm not rejecting this thought, but we shouldn't just assume it, okay? So when I'm confronted with a phenomenon, I try to take it for what it is. Let's say it hits my retina on my eyes, it's a picture. Well, let's deal first with the fact that we experience something and let's analyze that kind of experience before we make any assumptions. For example, that the world consists of atoms. And you're like, what the fuck? He says the world does not consist of atoms? No, no, no. Keep calm. Everything's fine. The world may exist of atoms, but we should not simply assume that. And we should be careful in what context we make such a claim. And this is already our first preparation of dialectical thinking. Many people think that dialectical thinking is something like, oh, he makes a thesis, the world exists, then he makes an antithesis, the world does not exist, and then he makes a synthesis, the world is and it stops existing, something like that. Though this is maybe a dialectical process, that's not necessarily what I mean by dialectics with Hegel. Dialectic means more that we develop thoughts by the way of how we engage in our experiences. And that's what I call a phenomenology. So this is my first interpretation of the title, but let's right dive into the text. So we start with paragraph 1. You can find this text on marxists.org. I'm not entirely sure how close it is to the Miller translation. I usually use the Miller translation. But overall, it does not matter so much to me. I think it's important to read a text in spirit, not with regard to every little tiny detail of what the words say. But again, there are also different interpretations of how that should be done. So let's really dive into it and let's read the first sentence, and you will already get a gist of why he's so hard to be understood. Let me read this sentence. In the case of philosophical work, it seems not only superfluous, but in view of the nature of philosophy, even inappropriate and misleading to begin, as writers usually do, in a preface, by explaining the end the author had in mind, the circumstances which gave rise to the work, and the relation in which the writer takes it to stand to other treatises on the same subject written by his predecessors or his contemporaries. Now, don't claim that I always get the sentence like the first time I read it. Of course, I read Hegel already a lot, so I feel like I can navigate through these texts right now quite easily, also because I read the preface already very often. But see, what's the topic here? So we should keep in mind that he says it seems, okay? So what he says after that is something that seems to be the opposite of what he claims to be the truth. And it seems that it is superfluous and inappropriate and misleading. So what is superfluous and misleading? Well, to begin, explaining what the author had in mind, like giving circumstances, how it is embedded in history, right? Which circumstances gave rise to the work? What led him to these thoughts? How was he developing it? How does he relate to predecessors and his contemporaries? And this is technically the idea that philosophy can start with pure thinking. And that is what he's criticizing here. Because I believe Hegel is a historical thinker, and that's also a bit of a controversial view that I hold here, namely that he is a relativist in terms of history, that all our thoughts must be developed with regard to history. And of course, we can maybe get through and then develop something that is absolute in the sense that we ground or we completely make transparent to ourselves how all our thoughts that we have are grounded in the historical experience and the historical knowledge that we have adopted from a tradition. So I'm sorry, I don't want to make it too complicated, but here we just keep in mind that he says many people assume that it is superfluous to explain where your position comes from. But very important, he says it seems. So this is not necessarily his opinion. So let's go to the second sentence. For whatever it might be suitable to state about philosophy in a preface, say an historical sketch of the main drift and point of view, the general content results, a string of desultory assertions and assurances about the truth, this cannot be accepted as the form and manner in which to expound philosophical truth. So again, we have the same thought here. He says a historical sketch seems not to be related to how philosophical truths should be developed. Probably we should start with a nice little neat statement and then we should develop it from there. I think, therefore I am, a Descartesian insight. No, that's not what Hegel says. Now let's go on. We still don't really know what he says, right? It's because we develop it dialectically, right? We dive slowly into the content, and now an analytic philosopher may say, well, that's already too complicated. I don't think so. He prepares the topic. So let's look further into what we can filter out from what he really says, filter that out of the text. Moreover, because philosophy has its being essentially in the element of that universality which encloses the particular within it. So here we see a true statement that he makes, right? He says, philosophy is this. What is philosophy? Philosophy is about universals that include particulars within it. Now, why is that important and what does he mean by that? See, when we study sciences, sciences are usually concerned with their particular object. Now, don't nail me down on that, but let's say physics is interested in physical objects. I don't know, like moving objects, atoms, I don't know what belongs into that category. Chemistry is interested in chemical objects, and biology is interested in biological objects like life and so on. These are particulars. These are things that we can find in the world of our experiences as real things. We can find biological objects such as humans. We can find water, which is a chemical substance. We can find ions and electrons, which are physical objects. Now, where do we find a true universal object? And that is the object of philosophy. The true object of philosophy, for example, is the world. Now you may say, well, the world is around me. It's not a universality. Well, where's the world? Show me the world. Can you point it out? Every time you point, don't point at the world. You point at trees, houses, cats, dogs, I don't know, whatever you point at. But what is the being behind it? To phrase it a little bit like Martin Heidegger. Now we know, however, that everything that is particular, and let me give it like a phenomenological turn again, everything that is particular is somehow embedded in a larger horizon, right? Where we say, well, that which it is embedded in, that's the universal. And let's push that to its extreme. That may be the world. So this is one of the topics that philosophy is particularly interested. And you see, it goes beyond, it transcends the physical horizon, right? That which we can really see and which we can really touch. Maybe we touch the world also when we touch the table, but first of all, we touch a table. So, and that is the reason for why I don't call these subjects physical subjects anymore. I call them metaphysical subjects, meta beyond. And which subjects belong to that? Surprise, surprise. God, the soul. These are topics, they may or may not exist. Okay, I don't say they exist or they don't exist, but if we discuss them, they are metaphysical subjects. And for that reason, for example, I always find it a bit odd when a neuroscientist who make great progress for humanity, I don't deny that, when they claim something like, oh, the soul does not exist. Keep in mind, I don't say the soul exists, but I don't say that for the same reason for why I feel it's a bit extreme saying that the soul does not exist. So this is dialectics. So we want to ask, why do we deal with these universals? Okay, so this is like the first statement that we get from Hegel. I would like to finish here, and next time we are going to start at paragraph 2 again. But let me just summarize. We started with the question for why was Hegel such a complicated author? And you may have an answer already, like an intuitive answer. Maybe you write to me what you think. Do you think he wrote in such a style as you have just seen because he wants to impress people? Or is it because this complicated style is related to the very difficult topic, which is dialectics? And it means that we don't tie it down to an intuition, but, as he will show, that the process is what philosophy cares about, the process of developing thoughts, not starting with a thought, but slowly developing it. And then, even when you have achieved a result, transcending it again. So, thank you very much. If you like this, please subscribe, give me a like, all this kind of YouTube spiel for the media. And I would be very interested again if you leave me a comment on how complicated you think this talk was. What else do you think about Hegel? I'm very keen hearing your thoughts on that and conversing with people about Hegel. So that's for it. So keep reading more Hegel and see you the next time.